Hi, my name's Pam Odey, and I want to talk briefly about the arts and cultural creative industries and what's happened to placements. We obviously are still in lockdown, and the arts and the creative and cultural industries are obviously closed in relation to performances, etc. And I know that the government has provided this extraordinary recovery fund to the value of 1.57 billion in relation to the arts and the creative cultural industries. But what's happened to placements? And I know that there is this employability campaign in terms of the Department for Education to actually introduce placements for a more sort of technical qualification in the post-16 and also in terms of further education, also in relation to higher education. But that's a very sort of, from reading the literature that has been published by the government in relation to these very employability focused approach on placements. It's very technicist. It's this acquisition of specific skills. It's this near market approach in relation to employability. I know it's more than tick boxing, but there is a very sort of technical skills focus in relation to the post-16 campaign policy initiative in terms of work placements. And the emphasis here is also on the organisation to be motivated through its social responsibility to provide placements, and hence we're seeing obviously some level of fatigue in relation to organisations actually making themselves available. So there's a sort of supply-demand market focus in relation to the plus 16 approach that we're seeing in terms of the Department of Education. But also, within the sociology literatures, there seems to be an insufficient sort of discussion around issues in terms of a sociology of placements. Here, a focus on the placements in terms of issues around identity and issues around sociality and issues around interpersonal relations and the development of the individual in terms of how they see themselves as a potential employer or employee. And so I think there is a lack of a sort of a body of theoretically framed discussion around a sociology of work placements. I've been thinking that there are, however, some threads. I can identify about 3 threads that are appearing in the literatures that can be woven together to actually be able to start to develop a sociology of placements. The first is inspired by the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and specifically his book Distinction. And here there is a focus in some of the literature around the work placements beyond this sort of technicist approach to employability, and a focus on the work placement in relation to immaterial capital and cultural reproduction. And there's another thread that I've discerned in relation to the literatures, and that is actually focusing from a more neo-Marxist approach that is looking at the placement in relation to post-industrial society, the knowledge economy, informationalized work processes, and understanding the work placement in terms of its relation to existing tensions between capital and labour. Here, discussions around disintermediation, discussions around the labour process, and discussions around possibly the way in which the placement is being positioned in terms of existing inequalities between capital and labour and tensions therein. And then there's another thread, and this another thread that's appearing in the literatures that needs to be woven together into a sociology of placements. And this is actually focusing on issues around equality and diversity. And this is really sort of optimistic set of literatures that I'm reading here, that's seeing the placement as an opportunity to actually enable more inclusion, inclusion within those sectors that seem to be still very much less accessible for minority ethnic groups, for example, working classes, for example, furthermore, women, for example. And so these literatures, I mean, have particularly interest in relation to the arts and the cultural and creative industries, in the sense that they are very sort of optimistic about how a placement could actually, through this sort of a more sort of diverse model of inclusion, enable equality of opportunity and enable sort of equality of access, and enable young people who might struggle to, for example, gain experience within the arts, theatres, technical features of the arts and the creative industries. The assumption being that a placement would actually be a positive intervention and enable inclusion where access has been very limited historically. So those are the three threads. And if we look here at the first of the three threads that I'm trying to weave together to put together a sociology of placements, and a sociology of placements that can start to give an account of the value of the placements in relation to the arts and the cultural creative industries, and start to have a conversation around what's happened to the placements in lockdown. Obviously, all the innovations that have been achieved so far in terms of the way in which the arts industries, theatres, etc., have enabled young people to actually work backstage, young people to, for example, in terms of sort of the technical features of the production of various performances. And yes, and so what's happened to that conversation? It seems not to be happening. I know there is concern around the loss of issues around viability in terms of the arts and the creative culture industries, but this whole generation of young people that have benefited from these work placements there seems not to be a dialogue about what's happened, obviously, during lockdown, and how these schemes will be replenished, etc. So, okay, in terms of a sociology of placements, so here I'm thinking about Bourdieu and how a framework around Bourdieu could help us to understand what's happening now in terms of placements, and how placements can be seen quite constructively and positively, or how they can be engaged with from other perspectives. Okay, and so the main issue here that I'm finding in the literatures, quite interestingly, is a focus on Bourdieu in terms of immaterial capital and in terms of cultural reproduction. And a key literature that is often being referred to is distinction. And here Bourdieu identifies the significance of material capital, yes, but also immaterial capital in relation to the reproduction of forms of social inequality. And here he therefore advances beyond Marx and Marxism, whereby Bourdieu argues that Marxism has an economic determinism which focuses too excessively on material capital to the expense of immaterial capital. And Bourdieu introduces the significance of understanding, of appreciating how the cultural reproduction of immaterial capital can also lead to alienation, can also be a source of inequality. And so in distinction, Bourdieu identifies two key themes that have particular significance in terms of understanding work placements, how they function, how they can be effective in relation to the arts and cultural creative industries. And so the two key features are the concepts of habitus, firstly. And habitus refers to a person's predisposition towards a certain form of culture. Habitus is cultivated in relation to, Bourdieu argues, our early years and our primary reference groups, family, for example, our close network, kin, etc. Habitus is this cultivation of sort of cultural values and cultural predispositions. And in Bourdieu's structuration approach, whereby he's looking at agency and structure and how they interrelate, habitus is key in terms of understanding issues around agency and the individual. And habitus is understood in terms of this long process of cultivation. It has what we would describe as a long durée. It has a long horizon. And moreover, habitus can also be understood at the level of the body as well, whereby we can understand issues around just the cultivation of distinct tastes, for example, in terms of culinary distinction, in terms of appreciating certain types of foods, for example, that we might associate with various class distinctions. So there's a level whereby habitus is cultivated very much in terms of our primary reference groups and in terms of our close networks. It's a cultural process, but then it's also embodied, and that our bodies are an expression of our cultivation of cultural dispositions. And so it's a very sort of significant sort of anchor in relation to Bourdieu's theory of structuration. Now, in conjunction with habitus, Bourdieu introduces the concept of the field. And the field refers to structured forms of social relations. And Bourdieu argues that the field is constituted by, yes, material capital, for example, in terms of finance capital, but even more significantly for Bourdieu's purposes, immaterial capital. And here he's referring, for example, in terms of symbolic capital. So the signs associated with status, for example, and also linguistic capital. And here this is a predisposition towards a form of verbal articulation that is resonant with what can be seen as being privileged higher social classes. And in conjunction with that, we have cultural capital, which is the one that we're often very familiar with, and this refers to sort of cultural values, ideas, etc. Knowledge, experience of a valued and privileged and prioritized form of culture. And in addition to those forms of immaterial capital, we also have social capital, which refers to our networks and our social relations and connections, and the value that is ascribed and cultivated therein. Now, Bourdieu argues that a person positioning within the field is very much a reflection of their habitus and its resonance within the field, within the forms of immaterial and material capital that define the field. So therefore, the field can be understood as a field of struggle. It is a field of competition. A person's achievement within the field is very much defined in terms of that composition, in terms of that sort of competitive pursuit of acquisition in relation to the forms of capital that define the field. But in Bourdieu's work, there is a notion of a tension in that pursuit of our positioning within the field, whereby there is a notion that if one's habitus aligns with the main forms of immaterial and material capital that define the fields, then that person will flourish. There's a resonance between the two. But there is also a recognition in Bourdieu's work that this is not just a mere fit, that the cultivation and the cultural reproduction of these forms of capital can be, and invariably are, more implicit than explicit. So, for example, he talks about how in the education system, these sort of embedded assumptions around a taken for granted sort of knowledge and awareness that is associated with for example, the higher forms of immaterial capital, is of benefit to those that are already from the habitus that aligns with those forms of immaterial capital. So in Bourdieu's work, there is a notion of a struggle, and there is a notion of a tension in terms of the positioning of one's habitus within the field. And this is what we understand, for example, within the arts. There is this notion, obviously, in Bourdieu's work, that one flourishes, can be successful within the arts if there is this almost resonance, yes, and empathy between the habitus of the individual and the forms of immaterial, material capital that define, for example, the arts. So here we'll have social capital, we'll have cultural capital, obviously, we'll have linguistic capital, obviously, as well, and symbolic as well, in terms of status, etc. Linguistic in terms of articulation and expression, for example. And Bourdieu recognises that the ascendancy of a form of capital, such that it is privileged, such that it is desirable in terms of its acquisition, is very much the making of that which is arbitrary as legitimate, such that he defines this as a process of symbolic violence, which is the making of what is arbitrary. It could be any form of culture, for example, or any form of high arts text, for example, or any form of text. It could be Shakespeare, it could be the poetry of Benjamin Zachariah, but why Shakespeare? So Bourdieu argues that this is arbitrary and it's made legitimate. So we have this notion in Bourdieu's work that the field is a field of struggle. The individual flourishes within the field if the habitus resonates with the forms of capital that define the field. And this has been very much the sort of logic that we see already in a lot of sociology works, that then says, well, then the work placement is an opportunity to cultivate or have experience of being within an organisation that has these, material capitals that define them, and which have been a limit to access for those that aren't from that habitus, almost propel them forward into these organisations that the apparent lack of these capitals that define that organisation, that almost work as gatekeepers in terms of that organisation, is almost to open up the gates and allow those from the habitus that might be alternative to that which is flourishing ordinarily within that, for example, arts or cultural and creative industry, enable it to give it a chance. And that has been the logic. So the logic that we're seeing in a lot of the sort of Bourdieu writings, Bourdieu-inspired writings in relation to placements from a sociology sort of background, has been this idea that the organisation that is providing the placement has had historically sort of limits to its access in terms of privileging certain forms of immaterial and material capital that anyone not from that habitus would struggle to actually be able to be involved or have entry into that organisation because they lack this habitus. And so the placement is to positively intervene and enable them to be placed within this organisation that ordinarily has and traditionally been using its forms of immaterial and material capital to almost be a gatekeeper in terms of access. And this is what historically we've seen in terms of the arts and the creative and cultural industries. And so that's the sort of Bourdieu-inspired notion of why the placement is an effective approach in relation to a levelling up, given young people from a different form of habitus from that's defined in the organisation, a chance. And so what I want to do is actually think about that, but introduce just a further set of features, and that's the idea that in the sort of work placement approach inspired by Bourdieu, there's a notion of the young person that is being placed within the arts and creative cultural industries, for example, as lacking. They lack the privileged material and immaterial capital, and this has to be compensated for, and this has to be sort of positively discriminated for, and an intervention has to be made to enable them to acquire that which they lack. And what I want to do is actually consider an alternative approach here, which actually recognises the young person that is to be placed within the organisation as having values and immaterial capital that has been cultivated from their habitus, that has value, that could be based on quite a atypical set of experiences and set of identities and knowledge, experiential knowledge, that could be of relevance to the organisation in terms of the placement. So rather than it's a case of the young person just absorbing and reflecting and reproducing the immaterial capital, values, etc. of the organisation so as to fit eventually in terms of a graduate recruitment. I would like to introduce the suggestion that we need to also listen to the habitus, listen to the experiences, the knowledge, listen to the forms of immaterial capital that is being cultivated by young people that are not necessarily from the traditional sort of habitus we would associate with the arts and creative industries. And in so doing, see the placement as a dual learning process, a process for the organisation also to have an understanding of this new generation of prospective employees and their experiences and their cultural and creative knowledge and in the immaterial capital that they cultivate and is being cultivated within their habitus, and enable that listening process to enhance and provide alternative ways of thinking, doing, in relation to forms of immaterial capital that have for generations sort of defined what is the sort of cultural identity of the organisation, or what is culture in relation to the arts and the creative culture industries. Okay, so following this, I have a video that you can watch. Obviously, if you'd like to, a video that is of an event that I filmed and interviewed some participants in relation to, that took place in Parliament Square in autumn of 2020, and it was in relation to the arts and the cultural creative industries, and this was high culture musicians that previously were playing in orchestra that during lockdown have been closed down, and it's the video actually contains interviews whereby issues around viability and employability, and the suggestion of the government needing to have new ways of thinking around what they consider to be viable, especially as these viability models seem to really come against the realities of being a musician or an arts and creative during the situation that we have experienced in terms of lockdown, and how the economics of their employment seem not to have been fully appreciated in relation to various forms of government provision. So the video that you can play now after this, it is an insight in terms of what I think is starting to be realised of a new way of actually understanding employability and employment in relation to the arts and the creative culture industries. And my starting point is in terms of what's happened to the work placements, what's happening to this next generation of arts and cultural creatives. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Okay, bye-bye.
job is done. I'm making sure they don't end up.
So hi. So my name's Pam, and I teach at the university, and I was listening to partly your conversation. I thought it was really interesting what you were saying around issues around viability and the way in which the modelling of employment within the creative industry has not fully been appreciated, and possibly there are now issues around unviability. Yeah? Okay. So I want to So I'm a university lecturer. I teach around issues around leisure, and I just wondered, could you just tell me why it was important for you to be here today?
Well, it's really important for us to support our sector of arts and culture. We're all musicians here today, but we've come to also support the stage crew, the lighting crews, the actors, like everybody in the arts and culture sector has been put on hold. And the government is not really showing the support that they are for other sectors, and we're just here to have our voices heard that we are viable. Like it was put in the press recently that the arts are not viable, and we are viable. We are important, we're valuable. I mean, we bring £10.8 billion to the economy every year, and for every pound spent on a ticket, there's another £2 spent at restaurants or bars, hotels. So we do contribute a lot to the economy. So we're just here to say, don't forget that.
Well said. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. I just wanted, could you just tell me more about the issue around viability and why it is that there's the way in which the government is actually managing the COVID crisis, which is very important and we completely support them, but how are they not understanding the viability model not applying to the cultural and creative industries?
Well, I'm a double bass player. I'm not an economist, but it doesn't take a genius to know that industry that is worth £10.8 billion a year to Great Britain needs more than 1.7 billion as a lifeline. That 1.7 billion is just about keeping some of the venues open. If the venues close, there will be nowhere to perform music in the future. But as well as that, there's all of the people around music, in and around music. It's not just the performers, the conductors, the players. There are jazz and the rock musicians and the West End show players. It's all of the staff behind them. Behind the scenes, the stage management, the production crew, everybody. Then there's also the box office staff, all of the people who serve you food and drink when you go out to anything. This industry creates work for 12 million people in Britain. Can you imagine the economic crisis if 12 million people are jobless? That's like nothing we have ever seen before in over 100 years, or ever, frankly. So the economic short-term view of the government in supplying the arts with an injection of 1.7 billion for an industry that's worth 10.8 billion a year is laughable. And you don't need to be an economist for that. Even a double bass player can work that out.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Okay, so so I'm interested in the future of the cultural and creative industries in terms of the new sort of generation of undergraduates that are watching these gatherings and trying to understand how they're going to map their careers in this changing cultural and creative industry.
Well, music has always relied on patronage. Haydn was in the Esterhazy court, Mozart had private patrons and then got very popular. And, sorry, I'm steaming up here with the mask, but that's all right. That's what happens.
But it's important we wear them. Okay.
I've, as well as performing with a lot of really incredible musicians, you know, from Madness and Brian May from Queen to classical and jazz musicians. I also teach a lot, and I've been teaching in primary schools, secondary schools. My double bass is getting away from me. And I've also taught in colleges, music colleges, Cambridge University, the Guildhall School of Music, and young offenders institutes and prisons. There is work out there. Education work is important, and this is not necessarily about educating people like you if you're an undergraduate to become a professional performer. There may be, if this government continues the way it is, there may be no professional performing in existence in a year or two. It's completely possible. But music has a way of surviving and needs to survive because music feeds our souls. So it's up to you to be an entrepreneur, to go out, find the funding, generate the funding, make something that's economically viable. We have something that's economically viable. £10.8 billion a year is what music, the arts industry is worth to this country. But if the government lets it die, it's up to you, if you're an undergraduate, to think about how you can make it survive. Keep the skills alive, because these skills, the things that brought you into education, further education, studying the arts, those skills are things that fire people up. Being creative is one of the key aspects of the success of this tiny nation, Great Britain. If we kill our creativity, we won't survive in the big world. So keep your creative ideas open, apply them to anything and everything you can. Anything you've learned from music or dance or drama, any skill you've learned, any ideas can be applied to something else. And anything you've learned from something else can be applied to your art, music, drama, painting, anything, sculpture. You can do this if you think outside the box, think creatively, and work out how to make it economically viable. And also vote for a government that will support the arts properly. This government is not doing that at all.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And your name, sir? My name's Pam, and your name is?
I'm Johnny G.
Johnny G. Lovely to meet you. Okay then. Bye bye. Okay then. Okay then. So I'll give you my email now. Okay.
Here's my card.
Thank you, Johnny G. Okay.
That's all right.
And my name's Pam Odie.
Pam Odie.
ODIH. And if you just type that, I think sometimes if you type that into Google, it will come through and you could be able to contact me.
ODIH. You're Goldsmith?
Yes.
Okay. Are you on LinkedIn?
No, unfortunately.
What's your number?
I'm not on LinkedIn. I'm not on LinkedIn.
No, do you have a mobile or an email?
Oh, okay.